Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The delivery driver, Mark, shook off the unsettling feeling crawling up his spine as he stood in front of the old house. He had made hundreds of deliveries over the years, but never to a house like this. The town was small, remote, tucked away from the bustling cityscape, and yet the house seemed even more isolated than the town itself. Mark glanced at the piece of paper in his hand again, confirming the address one more time. The package he carried was a typical delivery. Nothing special, but there was something strange about this house. It wasn't just the unsettling silence that clung to it, nor the peculiar absence of movement, but rather the way the air itself felt wrong, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Mark pushed these thoughts aside. He had a job to do. The front door was slightly ajar, and he hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. His footsteps echoed louder than they should have on the cracked cement path leading to the porch. The door creaked open further, as if beckoning him inside, but when he peered through the gap, he saw nothing but darkness. "Hello?" he called out, but his voice felt weak, swallowed by the oppressive quiet that seemed to emanate from the house itself. There was no response, not even the faintest sound of a breath or a shuffle of feet. With a deep breath, Mark stepped inside, trying to shake off the unease. The hallway was long and narrow, its walls adorned with aged wallpaper, now peeling in places. The faint scent of mildew clung to the air, and the floorboards creaked under his weight as though they were protesting his intrusion. He placed the package on the floor near an old coat rack that seemed to have been there for decades, its hooks empty, its surface coated in dust. It wasn't just the house that made Mark feel uneasy. It was the overwhelming feeling of being watched, as if invisible eyes were tracing his every move. But when he turned toward the stairs, no one was there. That's when he heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from upstairs. Mark froze, his heart skipping a beat. He was alone in the house, or so he thought. The floorboards above groaned again, followed by a soft shuffle of footsteps. They weren't hurried or panicked, just slow, calculated, as though someone was walking with purpose, but not in a rush. The sound drifted down toward him, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. "Hello?" Mark called again, this time his voice trembling slightly. No response. His mind raced. Maybe the owners were just upstairs, ignoring the doorbell. But why was the house so quiet? Why had the door opened by itself? These were questions he didn't have answers to. Suddenly, from across the street, a figure appeared, an elderly woman, hurrying toward him with urgency in her steps. She looked disheveled, as if she had been waiting for him, though she had no reason to. Her grey hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her eyes widened as she saw Mark standing on the porch. "What are you doing?" she called out sharply, her voice heavy with concern. "That house, it's been abandoned for years." Mark turned, still clutching the doorframe as if it might steady him. "But this is the address I was given," he said, confused, holding up the delivery log. "I'm just delivering a package. It says here the owner requested this." The woman's expression twisted into something strange, part disbelief, part horror. She glanced over her shoulder at the house, then back at Mark. "That house doesn't have an owner," she insisted. "No one has lived there for decades. Don't you know what it is? What's happened there?" Mark shook his head, unsure of how to react. "What do you mean? I'm just doing my job. Someone ordered this package." The neighbor's gaze drifted over his shoulder, her eyes narrowed as she scanned the interior of the house. "You don't Know what you're dealing with, she whispered, more to herself than to Mark. It's not just abandoned, it's cursed. Cursed? Mark repeated, feeling ridiculous. It's just a house. There's no such thing as curses. But even as he spoke, his skin prickled, the weight of her words sinking in. Before he could speak again, a sudden sound from inside the house made him jump. It was the unmistakable creak of the door slowly swinging open further, just enough to reveal the darkness within. No breeze could be felt, no cause for the movement. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He looked back at the neighbor, who had now stepped back, her face pale, her hands trembling. "You need to leave now," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. But something about the house, the way it felt, alive, pulled Mark forward. He shook his head, determined to get the delivery over with. "I'm just going to leave the package and go." The neighbor, almost pleading now, grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You don't understand. That house has a history. People go in, but they don't come out. You need to get away from here. Now." Mark pulled his arm from her grasp, unnerved but still skeptical. "It's just an old house, lady," he muttered under his breath. "Nothing to be scared of." He turned back to the house, his mind already making excuses, as he stepped forward toward the door. As he did, the silence enveloped him, suffocating. He could feel the house drawing him in, the temperature dropping with each step. Just as he reached the threshold, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Mark pulled it out, his brow furrowing as he saw the message. It was from his manager. "Address is a mistake. Package shouldn't have been delivered there. Do not go inside. Go back to the station immediately." A cold wave of realization struck him like a blow to the chest. He had been misdirected. The address shouldn't exist. The house didn't belong to anyone. But as he looked back toward the door, it remained open, inviting. For a moment, Mark considered turning around and leaving, but something else was pulling him toward the darkness inside. A whisper, a soft murmur that felt strangely familiar. The voice was his own. "Come in." A jolt of panic surged through Mark, and before he could react, he heard the faintest of footsteps coming from within the house. His own footsteps, mirroring his every move, but just a fraction of a second too late. The moment Mark stepped further into the house, the door behind him slammed shut. A chill swept over him, and for the briefest of seconds, he thought he might have imagined it. But no, there it was again. The door, which had opened so invitingly, was now firmly closed. The sound of the slam reverberated through the house, like the thundering of a distant storm, though there were no windows through which he could hear the wind. "Must be the old hinges," Mark muttered to himself, trying to shake the unease creeping into his thoughts. The words sounded weak, even to his own ears. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something he couldn't quite understand yet. The silence was overwhelming, and yet it felt suffocating, like the house was pressing in on him from all sides. He stood there in the entryway for a moment, his eyes flicking around the dark, shadowed hallway. Everything about the house felt wrong, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. Dust covered the old furniture, the dim lighting casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with a mind of their own. Then he remembered the delivery, the package. Mark quickly turned back to retrieve it, but as his hand brushed against the doorframe, a sharp jolt of electricity surged through his fingertips, making him gasp in surprise. He quickly pulled his hand away, staring at the frame as though it had bitten him. "Okay, that's new," he muttered under his breath, shaking his hand as if trying to rid himself of the lingering sensation. He glanced down at the package, still sitting on the floor near the base of the stairs, just where he had left it. The address was clear, on the label, but something about the handwriting now seemed off. It looked almost distorted, as if written by someone who had been in a hurry, or worse, someone who wasn't fully in control of their faculties. But it didn't matter. He had a job to finish. Mark bent down to grab the package, but as he did, a sharp creaking sound broke the quiet. It came from upstairs again, those slow, deliberate footsteps. But now they were louder, closer, and unmistakable. Mark froze, his pulse quickening. "Is someone up there?" he called out, his voice now tinged with uncertainty. He felt foolish the moment the words left his mouth, his heart thudding in his chest like the pounding of a distant drum. No response, only the soft, unsettling sound of footsteps creeping closer, now accompanied by something else. A soft breathing, almost imperceptible but undeniably present. Against every instinct telling him to turn around and leave, Mark stood there for a moment longer, rooted to the spot. The house seemed to watch him, every inch of it pressing against his skin, suffocating him with its eerie presence. His eyes flickered back to the door he had just passed. It was now slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning him, pulling him forward. He could swear he saw something move in the corner of his vision, a fleeting shadow, perhaps a trick of the light, but the feeling was unmistakable. Something was here, and it wasn't human. Mark let out a breath and turned away from the door, deciding to push through it. He had to finish his delivery and leave. There were too many oddities in this house for him to stick around any longer. As he reached for the package again, he heard it, the softest whisper. It was his name, drawn out, as though spoken by the walls themselves. Mark. His heart skipped a beat. The voice was unmistakably his own. He jerked his head toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. No one in sight, no explanation. The air felt heavier now, thick with an oppressive pressure that made it hard to breathe. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he struggled to regain control. "No," he whispered to himself, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous. It's just an old house, nothing more." He grabbed the package and stood up, straightening his back as though to convince himself he was in control. The house creaked around him, its groans rising up from the walls, echoing in the silence. Mark quickly turned to the door, his hand gripping the handle. But as he reached it, a voice, his voice, spoke again, softer now, yet somehow colder. "You shouldn't leave." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He spun around, heart racing, expecting to see someone standing there. But the hallway was empty. There was no one, only shadows stretching unnaturally long, draped across the floor. The house seemed to grow, larger around him, its walls seemingly expanding with each passing second. Every corner felt like it was closing in on him, pushing him toward the center of the house, toward the source of the voice. A sudden thought flashed through his mind. What if the house was alive? The idea was absurd. A house couldn't be alive. But the way the shadows shifted, the way his own voice echoed in his ears, it felt as though the house was watching him, waiting for him. Mark backed away from the door, his mind whirling with questions. He couldn't answer. He wasn't alone. He couldn't be. The neighbor had said this house had been abandoned for years. But something was here, something that wanted him to stay, something that would make sure he didn't leave. He was so lost in his thoughts. He barely heard the soft click of the door closing behind him, the sound so quiet it could have been the house sighing. When Mark turned back toward the center of the room, the lights flickered briefly, and then, before he could react, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure, his own figure, stood at the top of the stairs. Mark froze, his eyes wide, unable to move. His reflection was standing there, looking at him with those same cold, lifeless eyes, its movements perfectly mirroring his own. But it wasn't a reflection. This was something else. It was a shadow, a dark figure that shouldn't have been there, yet was. And then the figure moved. It turned, walking down the stairs toward him, its movements a second too slow, just like the footsteps he had heard earlier. Mark's pulse hammered in his ears. "What the hell?" he gasped, stumbling backward. His feet tripped over a loose floorboard, sending him crashing to the floor. But before he could even get to his feet, his voice, whispered from behind him, "You should have never come in." The walls groaned again, louder this time, and Mark felt an overwhelming pressure descend on him. The air grew thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something musty and old like decay. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, as though the house was alive. And Mark was now, a part of it, unable to escape. He had to get out. There was no other choice. But the door, where was the door? As Mark struggled to stand, the figure on the stairs reached out, its hand stretching toward him, its fingers twisting unnaturally, and the moment it touched the air, the temperature in the room dropped drastically. The house seemed to breathe, its walls exhaling in a terrible sigh. Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the terror rising like a wave, and then he heard it again. The voice, "You'll never leave." The air in the house was thick with the smell of mildew, and every breath felt like inhaling dust. Mark staggered backward, his hands pressing against the cold, damp walls for support. His heart raced, and his mind scrambled for answers he couldn't seem to find. His body was heavy, weighed down by something invisible, a force that clung to him, preventing him from thinking clearly. The figure, his figure, was still descending the stairs. Mark couldn't tear his gaze away from the uncanny sight. It was moving too slowly, as if mocking him. The way it moved was a distorted mirror of his own actions, but everything about it felt wrong, like a sick parody of his reflection. The figure's eyes were black, lifeless, staring straight at him, and as it came closer, Mark felt the cold seep further into his bones. He opened his mouth to shout, but no sound came out. Panic surged in him. He tried to turn, to run, but his legs felt like lead, stiff and uncooperative. He stumbled, falling against the wall, and when he glanced back toward the figure, it had stopped at the base of the stairs. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, in a voice that sounded like his own, but warped, distant and hollow, it spoke. "You've been here before." Mark froze, the words slithering through his mind like ice. He had been here before. What did that mean? His pulse quickened as confusion and fear spiraled in his chest. "No," he whispered, his throat tight. "I haven't. I've never been here before." The figure took another step toward him, the same deliberate movement, as though it were taking its time, savoring every moment. "You don't remember?" the voice echoed again, dripping with disdain. "But you will." Mark's breath caught in his throat. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but the house, the oppressive, suffocating house, seemed to be pressing in from all sides, making it harder to think. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he saw something flicker in the corner of his eye. A movement, but not from the figure. It came from behind him. Turning quickly, Mark scanned the dark hallway. There was nothing, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. He felt like a rat cornered in a maze, its walls slowly closing in, each turn leading to another dead end, and then, once again, he heard it, his own voice. But this time, it was coming from somewhere deeper in the house, from an unseen place, its words clear and insistent. "Turn around, Mark, you can't run from me." His stomach twisted in horror. This wasn't just a voice. This was something that knew him, that was him. It wasn't human. It wasn't a mere echo. This house, this thing that was suffocating him, was trying to consume him, to take him into itself. It was drawing him in piece by piece. He turned back to face the figure on the stairs, but it was no longer there. Instead, the hallway behind him was dark, but the temperature had dropped. His breath fogged in front of him, thickening the air. Mark shivered uncontrollably, feeling the heat drain from his body as if the house was sucking the life out of him. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance, something in the corner of his eye. He whipped his head around to see a dim glow coming from what looked like a room at the far end of the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and as he stared at it, he felt an inexplicable pull. The house was calling to him. It wanted him to enter. Without thinking, he moved toward the room, drawn by an unseen force. His footsteps were slow at first, uncertain, but as the light grew brighter, he quickened his pace, almost running now, as if his body had no control. He reached the door, and with a shaky hand he pushed it open. The room inside was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. It was clean, too clean, and the air, though still musty, didn't have that oppressive feeling. There were no shadows. Here, only the pale light illuminating a single object sitting in the center of the room. An old wooden chair. Mark stepped inside, his heart hammering, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The room was unnaturally quiet now, like it had been waiting for him to arrive. There was nothing in the room but that chair, and yet it was the only thing that seemed important. The rest of the space felt irrelevant. He approached it, and as his fingers brushed the back of the chair, he heard it again, the whispering voice now coming from behind him, cold and insistent. "You've always belonged to this house." Mark spun around in a panic, eyes darting across the empty room. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, sending his heart into overdrive. The walls around him seemed to close in, and he was trapped. Trapped in this place that was no longer just a house, but something else entirely. Something ancient, something alive. His breathing quickened as the air became stifling. He backed away from the chair, but his foot caught on something. He looked down to find a thick layer of dust on the floor, swirling as if disturbed by invisible footsteps. Mark turned back to the chair. Its simplicity was so stark, so unnervingly out of place in a house that seemed to breathe with dark energy. He reached for it again, feeling the roughness of the wood under his fingers. As he did, the temperature in the room dropped again, and the voice returned, this time even clearer, almost triumphant. "It's too late to leave now." Mark's heart sank as he turned toward the door. "It's too late to leave." The phrase echoed in his mind, repeating over and over like a curse. He was caught. This house, it wasn't just haunted, it was a trap, and he had walked right into. The house had known him before. It had chosen him. As he stood there, paralyzed with fear, the door creaked open. This time, it wasn't the same eerie whisper or distant command. It was a figure, standing in the doorway. Not the reflection of himself, but something far worse. The figure stepped forward, its face now fully revealed, hollow, featureless, and impossibly twisted. It smiled, a grotesque smile that stretched far too wide. "You are already part of this house. You always have been." Mark stood frozen, his body trembling from the cold that had begun to creep into his bones. The figure in the doorway, if it could even be called a figure, was no longer standing still. Its form, twisted and contorted, seemed to stretch in ways that defied logic, the edges of its limbs bending unnaturally, as though made from shadows rather than flesh. It smiled again, that grotesque, far too wide smile, its black eyes fixed on him with a predatory gleam. The air in the room had grown heavy, suffocating, the once stale odor now laced with something else, damp, earthy, like the scent of decay mixed with the sharp tang of iron. Mark's stomach churned as the silence between them thickened. "You can't run anymore, Mark," the voice whispered, though it was now coming from every direction, from within the house itself. "You belong here." Mark's breath hitched as the cold, clammy grip of dread spread across his chest, a weight pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. He stumbled backward, his feet skidding across the floor, as the figure slowly advanced. But with every step it took, something else was happening in the house, something that Mark couldn't understand. The creaks and groans of the walls grew louder, as if the very structure of the house was waking up. He could hear the distant sounds of water, faint at first, like a soft murmur, but growing steadily louder, almost as though something was moving beneath the floorboards. Mark turned quickly, his eyes scanning the room. The walls, once seemingly solid, were now warping, as if something inside the house was pushing against them. The sound of rushing water grew louder and his pulse quickened. The floor beneath him began to tremble, small vibrations at first, but enough to make him unsteady. It was as if the entire house had begun to shift, reconfiguring itself, but not in a way that made sense. It felt as though the house was becoming something else, alive, breathing, transforming. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, not sure if he was trying to convince the house or himself. "This isn't happening." But as he said the words, he felt the first cold splash of water rise around his ankles. It was thick, murky, and smelled of rot, as if the very foundation of the house had begun to break apart, letting the floodwaters in. Mark staggered back, slipping on the slick floor as the water crept higher. The figure stood motionless at the doorway, still smiling, watching him. Mark's breath came faster, his mind reeling. The floodwaters had started slowly, but they were quickly rising, surging into the room with terrifying speed. The wooden floorboards buckled under the pressure, water seeping through the cracks like an unstoppable tide. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the house seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. "Help!" Mark shouted, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the house, absorbed by the walls themselves. Panic surged in his chest as he turned toward the stairs, but they were no longer visible. The water had consumed them. The entire floor was flooding now, the water rushing upward, dragging furniture with it, twisting everything in its wake. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows against the walls. It felt as though the house was alive, and the flood was part of its twisted pulse, its hunger. Mark's feet were now fully submerged, the water swamping him, the cold biting at his skin as he desperately searched for any way out. The walls groaned again, and the water surged higher, rising up to his knees. He reached for the door, but before he could touch the handle, something pulled him back. A cold, wet hand, sticky and clammy, grasped his wrist. Mark screamed, trying to wrench free, but the grip tightened. He looked down, and his heart nearly stopped. The water had taken on an unnatural form. Human-like shapes were emerging from it, their limbs stretching, fingers long and gnarled, made of water and flesh, reaching for him. Their faces were featureless, nothing but black voids where eyes should have been, and they moved with a fluidity that was both horrifying and mesmerizing. They didn't speak, didn't need to. They only reached for him. Mark struggled against the grip, but the hands were relentless, pulling him deeper into the flood. His feet barely touched the floor now, the water rising steadily to his waist. Then his chest. The house seemed to be alive with it, alive with the suffering of something that had been buried here for far too long. "Help me!" he screamed, but his voice was choked by the rising water. The darkness beneath the floodwater grew more oppressive, as if the house was swallowing everything around him, consuming the light, consuming the air. And then, as if to answer his plea, the walls shifted once more, the house groaning, as it seemed, to bend toward him, its frame stretching and twisting. In that moment, Mark realized with horrifying clarity that the house wasn't just flooding, it was changing him, drowning him in its memory, its past, its hunger. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the room slammed open, and a gust of frigid air rushed in, sending a ripple through the water. It was the only way out. Mark fought against the hands dragging him into the darkness, his pulse racing as he moved toward the door, his limbs heavy from the cold, the flood, the weight of the house pressing against him. But as he reached the door, a voice, The same one he had heard before, his voice, whispered once more from the shadows. "You'll never leave." Mark turned, his heart sinking as the flood surged higher, reaching for him, pulling at his legs, dragging him back toward the center of the room. The door was within reach, but he could feel the house's grip tightening, closing around him, swallowing him whole. With every ounce of strength he could muster, he forced himself through the door, his body half submerged in water, the dark, inhuman shape slithering just behind him. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, but the floodwater followed, seeping under the doorframe, filling the hallway, rising. Mark could barely breathe as he scrambled toward the staircase, his feet slipping on the wet steps. The flood wasn't just water, it was something else. It was alive, and it was coming for him. The door slammed shut behind Mark with a violent crack, but the water continued to rise, seeping through the cracks beneath it. His heart pounded in his chest, drowning out the pounding of the water, the eerie groans of the house, and the soft whispers that filled the air. He stumbled backward into the hallway, gasping for breath, his lungs burning from the frigid, damp air. The house felt like a tomb, cold and oppressive, and every step he took seemed to echo in the hollow silence. Mark tried to focus, to steady his mind, but the water kept creeping higher, flooding the hallway, curling around his feet, and his legs grew weaker with every step. His thoughts were muddled. He could still hear that voice, his voice, calling to him, beckoning him deeper into the heart of the house. But now, the whispers weren't just coming from the shadows. They were coming from all around him, from within the walls themselves, the floor beneath him, even the water that lapped at his ankles. Help! Help! It was the voice of a woman, faint, mournful, the sound of someone in pain, someone who had been here for far longer than Mark had. Mark froze, his eyes darting around the hallway. The dim, flickering light from the single hanging lamp revealed nothing but shadows. Yet the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as though the house itself was urging him forward, pulling him closer to the source. "Where are you?" Mark whispered hoarsely, his voice trembling. The water had risen to his knees by now, and it was growing colder by the second. The walls groaned again, louder this time, as if something was moving inside them. Mark's breath came in shallow, gasps. He turned to run, but stopped short when a figure emerged from the darkness ahead. It was a woman, her body twisted and contorted in unnatural angles. Her hair hung in matted strands, dripping with dark, murky water. Her clothes, tattered, soaked through, clung to her frail frame. Her eyes were wide and vacant, hollow voids that seemed to stare directly into Mark's soul. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. Instead, there was a soft, gurgling noise, like the sound of water trickling from somewhere deep beneath the floor. Mark stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his throat. He couldn't breathe. This was a ghost. No, many ghosts, all twisted and wretched, drowned by the very water that now filled the house. No, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as his back pressed against the wall. I'm not part of this. I don't belong here." The woman's hollow eyes locked onto his, her mouth twitching as if trying to form words, but all that escaped her was a low, garbled moan. The water around her seemed to ripple and shift, and as Mark's eyes followed the movement, he noticed that the water was not just rising. It was moving, swirling in unnatural patterns, as though the spirits within the water were guiding it, drawing it closer to him. Mark could feel his body growing heavier, the weight of the water pressing against him, pushing him deeper into the darkness. He gasped as another figure appeared. A man this time, his skin pale and bloated, his clothes ragged and waterlogged. He moved toward Mark with a slow, deliberate pace, his feet leaving damp footprints behind him as he advanced. The man reached out a hand, his fingers long and unnervingly still. "You cannot escape," he whispered, his voice a croaky rasp that scraped at Mark's ears. "The house is hungry. It always eats." Mark stepped backward, his legs trembling beneath him. He felt the floorboards beneath his feet warping, creaking, as if something was rising from beneath the house itself. The figure, now joined by others, more ghosts, more spirits, some standing in water, some crawling, their eyes empty and dark, surrounded him. They reached for him with hands that were made of water and shadow, their movements jerky, unnatural, but still purposeful. "Help me," a voice whispered from behind him, the same woman's voice, now clearer, desperate. "Please, you have to help us, before it's too late." Mark turned sharply, his heart in his throat. Another woman stood before him, her face pale and gaunt, the outline of her body wavering in the floodwater like a reflection in broken glass. She raised her arms, trembling, as she reached toward him, her mouth opening in a silent scream, her eyes wide with panic. "We couldn't leave," she gasped. "And neither will you." Mark staggered back, panic flooding his veins as he realized what they were telling him. These weren't just random ghosts. These were the spirits of those who had been trapped in the house, swallowed by it, consumed by its dark, hungry force. They had become part of it, just like the house wanted him to be, trapped in an eternal cycle of suffering, of drowning, of never being able to leave. "No, no," Mark whispered, shaking his head violently, his body screaming for him to run. "This can't be happening. You're not real." But the spirits were real. They were all real. The water rose higher now, filling the hallway, and with it came more figures, more distorted shapes rising from the flood. The walls creaked again, and the house seemed to groan in response, a low, guttural sound that reverberated in the very marrow of Mark's bones. It was as if the house itself were breathing, shifting, pulling these spirits from the depths below, and now it was pulling him in too. "Help us," the woman's voice cried again. "Help, before the flood takes you too." Mark backed away, his breath ragged, his heart thundered in his chest as the spirits closed in around him, their faces twisted in agony, their hands reaching for him with desperate, hungry gestures. The walls of the house seemed to press inward, and the floodwater had begun to swirl in a vicious whirlpool, dragging him toward the center of the room. The spirits closed in tighter, and for the first time, Mark understood. The house wasn't just trapping him. It was feeding on him, on them. It needed their fear, their despair, their souls. "Please," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, the flood surged, pulling him off his feet and throwing him toward the center of the room. He gasped as the water closed over his head, the chilling, suffocating cold taking over. As he struggled to break the surface, he felt hands, wet, clammy hands, grasping at his legs, pulling him deeper. The last thing he saw before the water overtook him was the woman's face, her eyes wide with terror as she reached toward him. The world was muffled by the water that surrounded him. Mark could no longer feel the floor beneath his feet, and for a terrifying moment he thought he might never see the surface again. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, but the flood seemed endless, an abyss pulling him further down. His vision blurred, and he struggled to keep his head above the water. Every time he tried to swim, something unseen seemed to drag him back down. Then, just as he was about to succumb to the suffocating dark, the pressure released. The water, still high, but no longer rising, seemed to retreat slightly, leaving Mark hovering in a small pocket of air, his chest heaving in desperate gasps. He pushed his wet hair out of his face, trembling with fear and cold, and scanned the room. It was eerily quiet now. The spirits, once reaching for him with their cold, gnarled hands, had faded into the shadows, leaving only the faintest traces of their presence in the rippling water. The air felt thicker now, laden with an ancient heaviness that weighed down on him. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he pushed himself toward the far side of the room, his feet splashing through the stagnant water. His eyes darted around the flooded room, taking in the details. The house's eerie silence felt like a warning. And yet it wasn't just the flood that filled the room. There was something else, something more sinister, something buried beneath the water, beneath the very walls of the house itself. That's when he saw it. Across the room, hidden beneath layers of grime and muck, was a large wooden door. It was ajar, barely visible through the misty fog that had begun to settle in the room. Mark knew instinctively that this was where he needed to go. This door, this hidden passage, was the key to understanding what was happening to him. His legs wobbled as he forced his way through the knee-deep water, stumbling toward the door. The whispers from the house, those cold, familiar voices, seemed to be pushing him forward, urging him to discover the truth. The house had been waiting for him. He was part of its design now. As Mark reached the door, he hesitated for just a moment, unsure of what he might find on the other side. His hand, trembling, reached for the door handle. The coldness from the door seeped into his palm, sharp and biting. With a swift motion, he opened it. The door led down into a narrow, dark hallway, the air thick with mildew and decay. The sound of dripping water echoed from deep within the corridor, and a faint light flickered in the distance, casting strange shadows across the walls. It felt like the heart of the house, where everything had begun, and where it would inevitably end. Mark stepped cautiously into the hallway, each movement sending ripples of water across the floor. The house seemed to be breathing around him, the walls groaning as though it were alive, aware of his every step. The air was heavier here, more suffocating. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in. The hallway led to a large, open chamber, the floor covered with damp stones and patches of mold. At the far end of the room was a strange stone altar, its surface worn smooth by the passage of time. Surrounding the altar were ancient symbols, etched deep into the stone, their meanings lost to time but still pulsing with an ominous energy. The walls were adorned with faded paintings and frayed tapestries, their images nearly illegible in the dim light. But what caught Mark's attention the most was the heart of the room, a massive dark stone at the center of the altar, blood red, streaks etched into its surface. It was not a normal stone. It was a pulsating, living thing, like a heart, beating slowly and unnervingly, its rhythm like the slow, steady march of time. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. The stone wasn't just a part of the house, it was the house. The very foundation of the house was built around it, as though it were the heart of a living being, pumping its curse into the structure, feeding on the souls of those who entered. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls stretched, and the paintings on the walls warped, their figures twisting and contorting as if they were alive. Mark stumbled backward, his feet slipping on the slick stones beneath him. The air became suffocating, the smell of rot and decay mixing with something else, something metallic. The stone beat louder now, the sound reverberating through the room, and Mark could feel its power, its hunger, pulsing beneath his feet. He looked around frantically, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but the walls themselves seemed to be closing in, the symbols on the stones now glowing with an unnatural blood-red light. And then he heard it, the voice again, but this time it was not just his own. It was a chorus of voices, speaking in unison, as though they had been waiting for him to hear them. "You are part of the curse now," they whispered, their voices soft and cold. "You will never leave. You are bound to the house just as we are." The room shifted again, and Mark felt something pulling him toward the altar, a force stronger than any physical pull. The air around him grew colder, his body heavy as though it were being drawn into the stone itself. "No," Mark cried, struggling against the invisible grip. But the house was stronger than he was. The walls seemed to press against him, the voices louder, their words wrapping around him like chains. The flood, the ritual. It must be completed, the voices intoned, their tone now dark, reverberating through Mark's bones. You are the last. The house must feed. Your soul will be the final offering. Mark looked at the stone, the blood-red markings now swirling in patterns, pulling him closer. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing against him, suffocating him, and he knew with sudden clarity what he had to do. The stone, the house, the spirits, it wasn't just a haunting, it was a ritual, an ancient one, tied to the land, to the house, to the blood that flowed through the house's legacy. It needed his soul to complete it. The floodwaters surged again, higher than ever, sweeping through the room. Mark fought against the current, trying to reach the door, but the stone at the center of the altar throbbed with unnatural power, sending waves of darkness crashing through him. He was caught in its grip, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they consumed everything. And then, in that moment, he realized he wasn't trying to escape the house. He was the house. It had chosen him long ago. The air in the chamber grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating weight. Mark's chest tightened with every breath, his heart racing in his chest like the rhythmic pounding of the dark, living heart at the center of the room. The stone altar beneath him pulsed with an unholy energy, as if the house itself were feeding on his fear, his confusion, his every move. The floodwaters around him rose higher still, swirling with a life of their own, as if they were feeding off his despair. The water no longer felt like something natural. It was a force, an entity that seemed to move with purpose, its movement synchronized with the pulsing beat of the stone. Mark could feel the weight of the house pressing in on him, as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating him with their ancient, malicious energy. His legs felt weak as the water surged past his waist, the cold seeping deeper into his skin. He tried to move, to force his body toward the door, but it felt as though his limbs were being held by invisible hands. The voices, the ones that had been whispering to him, were now louder, clearer, more insistent. They echoed in his ears, twisting into a chorus of agonized wails. "You belong to the house," they crooned, their voices dark and menacing. "You are part of the flood. The transformation has already begun." Mark tried to cry out, to scream, but no sound came. His body was frozen, paralyzed, as though the very house had taken control of him. The walls groaned again, and the water surged, lapping at his chest now. His breath was coming in short, frantic gasps as he realized the horrifying truth. He was becoming part of the house. The flood was not just rising, it was transforming him, pulling him into its depths. His reflection in the water, the reflection that had haunted him since his arrival, began to shift. His face, once his own, was now changing. His features seemed to melt and twist, contorting in ways that defied logic. His skin grew pale, translucent, the very life draining from him as the water rose higher. The figure in the water smiled at him, an eerie, twisted version of himself, its eyes now dark and hollow, its grin stretching unnaturally wide. "No," Mark gasped, trying to break free, but the floodwater was relentless, pulling at him, dragging him down. His reflection, the house's reflection, stared back at him, its smile mocking, triumphant. It was no longer just a reflection. It was him. He was becoming the house. The transformation was no longer a subtle shift. The room around him warped. The very fabric of the space seemed to bend and twist, becoming something unnatural. The symbols carved into the walls pulsed with red light, their ancient markings now glowing ominously. The house itself was alive, and it was feeding on him. The floodwaters were not just water. They were the essence of the house's power, its hunger. Mark could feel it now, the darkness creeping inside him. His body began to shake, his hands trembling violently as he fought to hold onto his humanity, but it was slipping away. His pulse, once steady, now thudded in time with the beating of the stone. His skin felt cold, slick with the water, and, as he looked down at his hands, they seemed to melt into the flood, becoming part of it, part of the house. The transformation was happening too quickly, too powerfully. He couldn't stop it. "You are the last," the voices whispered, the sound coming from every corner, from every inch of the room. "The flood must be complete. You will be the heart of the house. The house will be you." A horrible realization dawned on Mark. The house was not just alive, it was a parasite, feeding on the souls of those it trapped. And now, he was its next offering. He wasn't just caught in a curse, he was the final piece, the last sacrifice to complete the ritual. The flood, the house, needed his soul to live, to survive, to continue feeding on the souls of those who dared enter its walls. The water around him began to swirl, faster now, like a whirlpool, pulling him toward the center of the room. The altar stone pulsed with power, its crimson light growing brighter, its heartbeat syncing with his own. The water seemed to respond to the pulse, as if it were drawing him closer to the stone, to the dark power that lay at the heart of the house. Mark struggled against the pull, but his body was weakening. The transformation was happening too quickly. He could feel his soul being ripped from him, being devoured by the house. His vision blurred, the edges of his world warping as the flood pulled him under, his body becoming part of the darkness, part of the curse. In a final, desperate attempt, Mark reached for the altar, his hand brushing against the cold stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a searing pain shot through him, as if the stone were burning him from the inside out. The voices screamed in unison, a chorus of agony, and the house itself seemed to tremble. The transformation had reached its climax. Mark was no longer Mark. He was part of the house, part of the flood. But in that last instant, as the darkness closed in around him, Mark understood. The house didn't just consume souls, it created them. It trapped them in endless cycles of suffering, feeding on their fear, their agony. And now he was part of it. He was part of the house's unending hunger, bound to it for eternity. The water surged one final time, and then everything went dark. Mark awoke in darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. No flood, no suffocating cold, just silence. But even in the dark, he could feel it, an overwhelming presence. The weight of the house pressed down on him, filling his senses with an oppressive heaviness. It was alive, and it was breathing, pulling him deeper into its grasp. Every corner of his mind screamed for him to wake up, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. There was no escape anymore. He opened his eyes, but the world around him remained pitch black. The floodwaters had receded, and he could no longer feel the cold bite of the water on his skin. But there was something else. His body felt different, unnatural. Mark struggled to sit up, his muscles stiff, unresponsive. It was as though his body had become one with the house, fused with it in ways he couldn't comprehend. His hand, when he raised it to his face, felt wrong. His skin, now thin and translucent, was stretched taut over his bones, and there was a strange, eerie coldness to his touch. He could no longer feel the warmth of his own body. His heartbeat, once so steady, was now synced with the pounding rhythm of the house's heart. The voice came again, a low, guttural whisper from the corners of the room, from within the walls, themselves. "You are here. You are part of it now." Mark's head snapped to the side, his senses sharp with fear, but there was no one there. No figure, no spirit, just the oppressive weight of the house pressing in around him. It wasn't just a place. It was an entity, a force, and now he was part of it. "No," he whispered, his voice thin and weak. This can't be real." A slow, creeping realization began to settle over him. His reflection, the one he had seen in the water, the one that had twisted and smiled back at him, it was no longer just a distortion. It had been a warning. His soul, his very being, had been taken, twisted, transformed by the house. He had become part of the curse. Mark's vision blurred as the house seemed to shift, its structure warping before his eyes. The walls cracked, the floors trembled beneath him, and the once familiar room around him began to fade, replaced by images, faces, memories, echoes. The house was showing him what had happened before, what would happen again. The ancient rituals, the blood sacrifices, the endless cycle, it had all led to this. The house wasn't just a place of haunting. It was a living, breathing prison for souls. Those who entered, like Mark, were chosen to become a part of it, a part of its hunger, a part of its endless, cyclical feast. He saw the faces of the previous victims, the ones he had heard in the walls, the ones who had begged for help. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams as they, too, were transformed by the house. They had become one with it, trapped in an eternal loop of suffering, their souls feeding the house, keeping it alive. And now, he would join them. "You are the last," the voice whispered again, and Mark could feel the words curl around him like chains. "You will never leave. You are the final piece of the house's hunger." Mark gasped, his mind reeling. The house, the ritual, it wasn't just about trapping souls. It was about feeding the curse, feeding the hunger that had been festering in this place for centuries. The souls it consumed were bound, here, trapped within its walls, feeding it, making it stronger, making it alive. And now Mark was no different. He was no longer just a man. He was part of the house, just like the spirits, just like the flood. He could feel the change in his very bones, the weight of the curse settling deeper within him. His soul, his essence, was being consumed, twisted, reshaped into something else entirely. "Please," Mark whispered, his voice breaking, as the walls around him began to close in once more. He reached out, but there was no one to hear him. The house had taken everything. It had taken his past, his future, his very identity. The light in the room flickered, then dimmed. In the darkness, Mark saw something that had not been there before. A reflection. No, it wasn't his reflection. It was a shadow, a figure standing in the corner of the room. He could feel its presence, its hunger, its emptiness. It was him, but it wasn't. The figure moved forward, its form shifting and twisting, its features melting into the shadows, into the walls. It reached out toward him, its fingers like claws. Its smile twisted in that same sickening way his reflection had once smiled. The figure spoke, its voice a low, echoing growl that reverberated through the room. "You are part of me now. You will never leave." Mark's body froze and his mind screamed for release, but there was nothing left. The house had claimed him. He was no longer Mark. He was part of the house. And as the flood waters rose again, this time without end, he could feel his body being pulled toward the heart of the house, toward that pulsing stone, that ancient core that had been waiting for him. The walls closed in around him, the house's pulse quickening, and Mark felt his soul being consumed, his essence absorbed by the hunger of the house. He was a part of it now, part of the curse, part of the endless cycle of torment that had claimed all those who came before him. There would be no escape, not for him, not for anyone. And as the house swallowed him whole, he understood the final, horrifying truth. The house never lets anyone leave. The floodwaters would always rise, the curse would always feed, and the house would live on, feeding on the souls of those it trapped for eternity. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The radio crackled through the dense mounting static. It was 11:42 p.m., and the mountain was already starting to rumble with the storm that had settled over the peaks. A cold wind howled, pushing rain sideways, battering the trees, like nature itself was waging war against the earth. Inside the ranger station, the warmth of the old wood stove couldn't quite chase away the chill creeping into the bones of the park ranger, Mike Carter. He rubbed his eyes, having already been awake for hours, knowing the storm had been brewing for days. But nothing prepared him for this. His radio squawked again, louder this time, the voice cutting through the wind's howls. Mike. Mike. Do. You copy? Mike grabbed the receiver with a practiced hand, his fingers slick from the dampness in the air. He listened, his body already tense as he recognized the voice of the rookie, Jason, who had only recently joined the team. Mike, we've got a report of a lost hiker up near Copper Ridge. Someone spotted him about an hour ago, but no one's seen him since. Copper Ridge. Mike's brow furrowed. That trail was treacherous even in clear weather. In a storm like this, it was nearly suicidal to venture up. Is he alone? Mike asked, his voice steady despite the growing unease. I don't know, Jason responded, his voice sounding shaky, just a hint of fear creeping in. They said they saw him standing by the edge of the cliff, but when they tried to approach, he turned and disappeared into the fog. No sign of him. After that, Mike's stomach tightened. We're going up, he said, cutting the conversation short, already grabbing his pack. He didn't need to hear more. The urgency in Jason's voice was enough. If someone was out there in this storm, the search was going to be hard enough, if it was even possible at all. The storm was turning into a beast, roaring like a hungry animal, as if warning them all not to step into its jaws. The mountain's shadow seemed to grow larger with every minute. Mike pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and headed out the door, the wind slamming against him, cold as ice. The others in the station, Jason, Lisa, and Marco, were already waiting by the truck, staring into the blackness of the mountain. They had all heard the reports, but Mike could feel something in the air, something beyond the storm, something far worse. He had been a ranger long enough to sense when things were wrong. The truck bounced and jostled as it climbed the narrow trail toward Copper Ridge, the tires slipping on the wet, muddy path. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the rain beat down like 1,000 needles on the roof. You really think someone's up there? Marco asked from the back seat, his voice a mix of skepticism and concern. I don't know, Mike said, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying to pierce through the rain. But the report came in, and if someone's out there, we're the only ones who can get to them. We don't have a choice. Lisa, the medic, was scanning the surroundings as they drove. How bad's the storm gonna get? Worse, Mike, muttered, tightening his grip on the wheel. We need to move fast. They parked at the trailhead just as the first bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the mountain's jagged face. The air smelled of wet earth, pine, and something else. Something musky and ancient, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The storm was making the search harder than it should have been, but the mountain wasn't known for its mercy. The wind howled in their ears as they adjusted their packs and checked their gear. The whole scene had a sense of finality about it, the air so heavy with pressure that it felt like the earth was holding its breath. Jason adjusted his flashlight and glanced at Mike, his voice tight. I don't like this, Mike. None of us do, Mike said, squinting through the storm. But we're not leaving until we find him. The team started their hike up the mountain, each step in the slick mud sending a shiver through them. As they climbed, the wind seemed to shift, the temperature dropping dramatically. There was an unnatural stillness in the forest around them, like the world had gone quiet in anticipation. The usual noises, the rustle of leaves, the chatter of animals, had vanished. All they could hear was the storm's roar and their own footsteps crunching against the underbrush. "Mike," Jason called, his voice trembling. "You hearing that?" Mike stopped, frowning. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but there was still no sound from the usual forest creatures. There was something else, a low, soft whispering, like a conversation happening just out of reach. The team froze, their eyes scanning the shadows. "I don't hear anything," Lisa said, voice steady. Jason looked at Mike. "I swear, it's coming from the ridge." Mike's heart skipped a beat. "Let's move," he ordered. He wasn't sure if it was the storm playing tricks on their minds, but there was a feeling creeping over him, like the mountain itself was holding them in its grip. They continued up the trail, the darkness growing thicker around them, and the feeling of being watched pressing in on every side. The wind began to die down, but the pressure was building, an unsettling quiet that seemed to permeate the space. As they neared the ridge, they spotted something ahead, a figure standing motionless at the edge of the cliff. His silhouette was barely visible through the fog, but they could make out the tattered remnants of a jacket flapping in the wind. "There he is," Marco whispered, relief flooding his voice. But as they called out to him, the figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge them. The storm's grip on the land had loosened, but the tension in the air grew thicker, heavier. "Hey!" Mike shouted, his voice carrying across the ridge. "Are you okay?" The man's head snapped around. His face was obscured by the deep shadow cast by his hood, but the eyes, dark, empty eyes, seemed to pierce through the fog. And then, without a word, he turned. He walked away, disappearing into the thickening fog. "Wait!" Mike shouted, taking a step forward. They all ran toward the spot where the figure had been, but as they reached the cliff's edge, the fog swallowed it all. No trace, no footprints, nothing. "Where did he go?" Jason asked, breathless, staring at the blank space before them. Mike stood motionless, a chill running up his spine. He looked around, his instincts kicking into overdrive. "He couldn't have vanished like that," he murmured. The air felt wrong. It wasn't just the storm or the strange encounter. The mountain, the forest, it all felt alive, watching them. "Let's head back to the station," Mike said, his voice firm, but even he didn't feel certain of the decision. Something isn't right about this. But as they turned, their radios crackled again. The voice on the other end, distant, tinny, was the same as before. "He's not the only one. They never leave." The team made their way back to the ridge, but the world around them had changed. The fog was thicker now, swallowing them whole, as if the mountain itself had grown larger in the dark. The rain had slowed to a misty drizzle, but the air was thick and cold, the kind of cold that sunk into your skin and made the bones ache. Even though the storm's rage had subsided, the oppressive weight in the air felt like it was growing heavier with each step they took. Mike led the way, his flashlight slicing through the fog, but the beam barely touched the ground in front of him before being swallowed by the mist. Every tree, every rock seemed to look the same. The path ahead was almost indistinguishable from the landscape around them. The eerie stillness from before had returned, the usual sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, utterly absent. "I don't like this," Jason muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes darted nervously to the shadows that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally. He felt it too, the overwhelming feeling of being watched. It was as if the mountain was a living, breathing thing pressing in on them, smothering them. "We're just spooked from what we saw earlier," Mike said, trying to reassure himself as much as his team. "Let's focus on the task at hand." We need to find him. They pressed on, the trees growing denser as they climbed higher. Mike kept glancing over his shoulder, feeling an inexplicable tension in the pit of his stomach. The rookie's unease was contagious, and even Lisa, ever the optimist, seemed unnerved. It didn't help that the trail had become more treacherous, the mud thick and slippery, making every step a challenge. The wind had begun to pick up again, but instead of a steady howl, it seemed to twist and snap in sharp bursts, like an animal's breath just over their shoulder. Every now and then, a particularly strong gust would make the trees creak ominously. "Do you hear that?" Marco asked suddenly, his voice low, almost cautious. The others stopped in their tracks, straining to hear. At first there was nothing but the rustling of the wind, but then, unmistakably, there was a sound, a low, soft whisper, like voices, drifting toward them on the breeze. Jason's breath hitched. "Is it the wind?" Mike shook his head. The voices were too clear, too distinct. "I don't know." The whispering seemed to come from all around them, not from a particular direction, just everywhere. It was faint at first, but as the team stood still, listening, it grew louder. The wind carried it further, and now it sounded like multiple voices all speaking at once, but none of them making sense. And then one voice rose above the rest. "Help me." Jason froze. That voice, it was faint, but familiar. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Mike stepped forward, his hand tightening around his flashlight. "That came from over there," he said, pointing toward E, a darkened area of the trail that seemed to spiral downward into an even deeper part of the mountain. They moved cautiously, but every step felt like a violation. The air grew colder, more suffocating, and the oppressive silence returned, leaving them alone with the echoes of the voices in their heads. With every footfall, Mike could feel a strange pressure against his chest, as though the very mountain was resisting them. His skin tingled with something beyond the cold, like a static charge in the air that promised something unseen would reach out and touch him. As they rounded the bend, the faint cry for help sounded again, closer this time. It was louder, like it was right there, just beyond the veil of fog, just out of reach. Then it stopped. And the silence that followed was worse than any noise they had heard. The atmosphere seemed to hold its breath, like the mountain was waiting, watching. The team stood at the edge of the trail, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Should we keep going?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling, her hand clenching the strap of her pack. "I mean, this feels wrong." Mike hesitated, his instincts urging him to turn back, but they couldn't afford to. Not with the hiker still out there, alone in this storm. "We're not leaving until we find him," Mike said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. They continued forward, but the trail began to grow steeper, and the trees seemed to close in around them, blocking out even the pale moonlight. The deeper they went, the thicker the fog became, until Mike could barely see beyond the beam of his flashlight. That's when it happened. A shape, just a shadow, moved in the mist, flickering like a mirage. It was a figure, standing still, but just out of reach. Mike's heart skipped a beat. "Did you see that?" Marco asked, his voice shaky. Mike nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Stay close, don't split up." They moved cautiously toward the figure. As they neared, Mike's stomach twisted. The figure was standing at the edge of another cliff, motionless, looking out into the abyss below. "Hey!" Mike called, stepping forward. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't move. Instead, it tilted its head slowly, almost unnaturally. Mike's breath caught in his throat. There was something wrong with the way it stood, the way it swayed just slightly with the wind, as though it weren't fully tethered to the ground. Jason's voice cracked. "It's him. It's the hiker." The team was almost close enough to reach out and touch him, but then, like before, the figure moved. Slowly, it turned away and walked into the fog. No words, no response, just the sound of its boots dragging through the wet earth. "No," Lisa whispered, her voice barely audible. Mike's pulse quickened. They rushed forward, but again, just as they reached the spot, the figure had vanished into thin air, like it had never been there. No footprints, no trace. Mike's mind was racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. "We're being played," Marco muttered, his voice trembling. "This place, it's messing with us." Mike clenched his jaw. "We need to get back to the station. Now." But as they turned to leave, the whispering voices returned. Louder, closer. This time they were unmistakable. Stay with us." Jason spun around, his eyes wide with panic. "They're not human," he whispered, as his flashlight flickered and died. The air felt suffocating now, like the fog had substance, like it was crawling toward them, wrapping around their legs. Mike had seen enough. His gut told him something was terribly wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. They were stuck. The mountain was alive, and it wasn't going to let them go. The mountain seemed to breathe around them. The fog, thick and suffocating, pressed in on the team from all sides. Even the faint light of the moon was swallowed by the dense mist that curled through the trees like tendrils of some unseen force. The air was growing colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as if the mountain was preparing for something terrible. Mike's footsteps were heavy as he led the team deeper into the unknown. Each of them felt the weight of the silence pressing on their chest, making it harder to breathe. It was like the mountain itself was alive, its pulse syncing with theirs, watching, waiting for something. "Mike, we're not getting anywhere." Jason's voice cracked, his words hanging in the air like a cold gust. He glanced around nervously, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The others had said nothing, but the tension was clear in their eyes. The trail had disappeared completely. The path that once seemed so familiar was now indistinguishable from the twisted trees and rocks that surrounded them. "I know," Mike replied, trying to sound calm despite the growing unease. He hadn't wanted to admit it, but the mountain was confusing them. The fog had twisted the trail, made everything look the same. It was like they were walking in circles, and with every turn, they were going deeper into the heart of the mountain's darkness. As the team trudged on, the sound of their footsteps was the only thing that broke the stillness. The wet ground squelched beneath their boots, and the distant howl of the wind was the only other sound that echoed through the trees. The oppressive silence seemed to hold its breath around them. Then, as if summoned by their anxiety, the figure appeared. At first, it was just a flicker in the fog, a vague silhouette that shifted with the wind. But as they moved closer, it became clearer. There, standing at the edge of a steep drop, was a man. His jacket was torn and weathered, much like the description Jason had given them earlier. But there was something about the way he stood that made Mike's stomach twist. He wasn't moving. "Hey!" Mike shouted, his voice louder than he intended. "Are you all right?" The figure didn't respond. He just stood there, facing away from them, as though unaware of their presence. The dim light from Mike's flashlight fell on him, but the figure's face remained hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. His posture was stiff, unnaturally rigid, as if he was frozen in place. "Who the hell is that?" Marco muttered, stepping forward with a sense of urgency. The tension in his voice was clear. "Hold on," Mike cautioned, holding out a hand to stop Marco. He felt a strange pull, an instinctive warning that told him to stay back. The way the figure stood, like a statue, set off a primal alarm within him. There was something wrong about the scene. It didn't sit right. The stillness, the fog, the way the figure seemed out of place, as if he didn't belong to this world. "Maybe he's lost too," Lisa suggested softly, her voice shaky. "We need to help him." Mike swallowed hard, glancing around the fog-cloaked forest. His instincts screamed at him to leave, But they couldn't abandon him, not when they were already so close. "Stay together," Mike said firmly, taking a few cautious steps toward the figure. But before he could take another step, the man's head slowly turned. The movement was slow, deliberate, and wrong. It wasn't like someone who was turning to look at them. It was as though his body had been forced to turn, mechanically, against its will. Mike felt a cold shiver run down his spine. And then, the figure raised a hand. Slowly, his fingers curled into a fist, as if he were summoning something. Mike froze. His blood turned to ice. "Is he?" Marco started to say, but his voice faltered as the figure suddenly started to move away, turning toward the dense fog that swallowed the trail ahead of them. "He's walking away," Lisa cried out, panic rising in her voice. "What the hell's going on?" The figure walked slowly, deliberately, into the fog, and the team moved after him instinctively. Mike's heart hammered in his chest, and his legs felt like lead. This wasn't right. This was no lost hiker. "Wait!" Mike shouted, his voice rising in urgency. "Stop!" But the figure didn't stop. Instead, it moved further into the mist, its form becoming less and less distinct with every step. The fog seemed to devour him, as if the mountain was pulling him into its depths. "We can't let him go like this," Jason muttered, but even his voice had a quiver of doubt. "Follow him," Mike commanded, trying to force his legs into motion. His body refused to obey, each step forward feeling like he was being dragged into something far darker than the storm. They pushed forward, the fog thickening, the ground beneath them shifting. But just as they neared the spot where the figure had been, the fog parted for a brief moment, and they saw nothing. The man had vanished completely. "No!" Jason gasped, his flashlight frantically sweeping over the ground. "No footprints, no sign of him." The team spun around, searching the area, but there was no sign of the man. Not a trace. "Where did he go?" Marco asked, his voice frantic, his breath heavy with fear. "He was right there. How can he just—" The fog closed in again, tighter this time, suffocating them, wrapping them in its embrace. The mountain felt oppressive, as though it was bending them, shaping them into something they didn't recognize. It wasn't just the storm anymore. It wasn't just bad luck. Mike could feel the change in the air, the stillness, the suffocating weight of it all. And in that moment he knew they weren't just searching for a lost hiker anymore. The mountain was playing with them. And something far older, far more sinister, was making sure they'd never leave. The silence that followed the disappearance of the figure was almost worse than the haunting whispers they had heard earlier. It was as though the mountain had swallowed them whole, leaving nothing but the thick fog, the unyielding trees, and a crushing weight in the air. The team stood frozen in place, their breath visible in the cool air, their hearts thudding in their chests. There was no sound, nothing but the gentle rustle of the wind, though it felt wrong. The wind no longer had the rhythm of nature. It felt controlled, directed, as if it was moving with intent. "Mike." Jason's voice was barely a whisper, his breath shaky. What just happened?" Mike didn't answer right away. He couldn't. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. The figure had been there, so real, and yet in the blink of an eye, it was gone, swallowed by the fog, as if it never existed. But Mike felt something. Something in his gut told him that it wasn't just the fog that hid the man. The mountain, the land, they were hiding him. Or worse, taking him. "We need to move," Mike said, though his voice didn't sound like his own. It was heavy with the weight of something he couldn't explain. He didn't know what had happened. But he knew one thing for sure. The mountain was playing a dangerous game, and if they weren't careful, they'd be the next pieces moved on the board. Reluctantly, the team began walking again, each step feeling like they were marching into the maw of some dark creature that waited patiently for them to slip. Every sound, every rustling leaf, Every snap of a twig beneath their feet seemed magnified in the quiet, amplifying their sense of isolation. There was no turning back now. The fog had closed in even further, wrapping itself around them like a shroud. The trees were no longer familiar. The trail, if it had even been a trail to begin with, was gone. Now it was just a labyrinth of wet, gnarled roots and twisted branches, the darkness of the night pressing down on them. Mike led the team, his flashlight cutting weak paths through the mist. But even the light seemed to be fighting the suffocating fog, as if it were afraid to shine too brightly. "We're not getting anywhere," Lisa murmured, her voice tight with frustration. "We've been walking in circles." Mike turned to her, his eyes searching the darkness. "I don't know," he muttered, shaking his head. "It's like the mountain is moving. The trail keeps changing." Jason shook his head. "No way, that's not possible, Mike." But the doubt was creeping into his voice, and they all heard it. The unspoken fear that maybe, just maybe, something unnatural was at work here. Then they heard it. A soft sound, barely audible at first, but growing louder. It was the sound of water, the faintest trickle at first, as if it were coming from a distant stream. But it was increasing, growing in volume, a deep, relentless rush that made the ground vibrate beneath their boots. "Water?" Marco asked, confused. "But it wasn't raining that much, was it?" Mike's heart skipped a beat. He had been so focused on the fog, the figure, the voices. But now, hearing the unmistakable sound of rushing water, something in him snapped into place. The flood. The flood was coming. "Get to higher ground," Mike ordered, his voice clipped with urgency. They had to move now. The flood was rising, and the mountain's grip was tightening around them. They began to scramble up the slick rocks and uneven ground, the sound of rushing water growing louder and louder with each passing second. The air seemed to vibrate with it, the ground shifting beneath their feet as if the earth itself was shifting with the flood. The trees around them groaned as the water rose higher, filling the space between the trunks with murky, cold water. It was as though the mountain was preparing to swallow them whole. Mike pushed forward, his thoughts racing. They couldn't outrun the flood. They couldn't outsmart it. It was as if the mountain was alive, manipulating its own environment, playing with them like insects in a jar. He glanced back at the others, their faces pale with fear, their eyes wide in panic. He could hear their breath, sharp and desperate as they struggled to climb higher. But as they pushed on, the flood didn't stop rising. It spread out beneath them, flooding the forest floor, the water surging faster than they could climb. And then the air, thick, heavy, and saturated with fear, changed again. It wasn't just water that filled the air now. The whispers returned. The same whispers from earlier, faint but growing in volume, like voices carried on the current. And this time, they weren't just distant sounds. They were close. Too close. "Mike," Jason's voice was shaking. "What is that?" Mike looked down, and his stomach lurched. The water was rising, yes, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what was rising with it. Figures. Human-like figures. They were emerging from the water, their bodies bloated and disfigured, their movements jerky and unnatural. At first it was just one or two, then more, dozens of them. Each figure had the same hollow eyes, the same outstretched hands reaching toward them, as though the water itself had become a vessel for the lost souls of the mountain. They had no faces, only empty, gaping spaces where their features should have been. "Move, now," Mike screamed, his voice breaking through the horror. But it was too late. The flood surged higher, the figures closing in. The team scrambled, panicked, slipping on the wet rocks and trees, their breaths coming in frantic gasps. But the water didn't care about their panic. It didn't care about their efforts to escape. It was dragging them in, slowly, inexorably, like the mountain was pulling them into its dark heart. As Mike grabbed Lisa's arm to pull her to higher ground, he glanced around, his heart pounding in his chest. The flood had overtaken them. There was no escape. The figures were closing in, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. And then, just as the water reached his knees, Mike heard a voice. Low, distorted, whispering his name. Mike! He spun around, his flashlight flickering in the water's swirling current. The figure of the man in the torn jacket appeared again, standing at the edge of the flood, staring at him with those empty eyes. But this time, Mike didn't feel fear. He felt something far worse. He felt recognition. The man wasn't just a lost hiker. He was the one who had called them here. He was the one pulling them deeper into the mountain's grasp. And as Mike took one final step backward, the world around him began to bend. The trees twisted, the earth churned, and the flood surged higher. The mountain was alive, and they were all going to drown in its memory. The floodwater was rising, surging with a relentless hunger that seemed to echo the mountain's deep, twisted breath. It crashed against the trees, submerging the once familiar landscape in a sea of murky, churning water. Each step they took was harder than the last, the thick sludge of mud and water making it nearly impossible to keep their footing. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the storm pressing down on him. The mountain had transformed into something unrecognizable. The flood wasn't just a force of nature. It was part of the mountain's curse, an ancient force bound to this place. A force that was now claiming them, one by one. Mike, what are we supposed to do? Jason's voice trembled behind him, a stark contrast to the steady pace Mike had forced himself to maintain. Mike didn't answer at first. His mind was racing. The water had risen higher in the last few minutes, swallowing everything in its path. The figures, those things, were still emerging from the flood, their pale faces twisted and ghostly. Some seemed to glide through the water as if weightless, their empty eyes following the team's every move. Others were stumbling, their limbs contorted and jerky, like marionettes pulled by unseen strings. But it wasn't just the figures that frightened Mike. It was the whispers. They were louder now, and no longer just in the distance. They were in his ears, in his mind, as though the very air was saturated with voices. He could hear them calling his name, soft at first, but growing more insistent with every passing second. Mike. He shook his head, trying to push the voices away, but they were unrelenting. Do you hear that? Lisa asked, her voice low and frantic. The whispers. They're saying our names. Mike glanced at her, his eyes wide. I hear them, he whispered, swallowing hard. But we have to keep moving, we can't stop. The others nodded, though fear was painted on their faces. The flood was now up to their waists, the force of the water making every step harder. They had to get higher, had to reach the ridgeline where the water wouldn't reach them. But the mountain had other plans. A chill ran down Mike's spine as he glanced at Marco, who had fallen behind. His flashlight flickered in the water, illuminating something in the mist that made Mike's blood run cold. A woman. She was standing in the water, her body shrouded in the fog. Her clothes were tattered, soaked through with mud and water, but it was her face that made Mike's heart stop. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids, her mouth stretched open in a silent scream that sent a shiver of pure dread through him. Marco. Move! Mike shouted, pulling Marco's arm urgently. Marco looked up, his face pale as he followed Mike's gaze. The woman was no longer standing still. She was moving toward them, her head jerking at unnatural angles, as if something was controlling her movements. No, Marco gasped, stumbling backward in the water. That's not real. That can't be real. But the woman's figure was growing closer, her movements jerky, unnatural. She was dragging herself toward them, her arms outstretched, her fingers twitching with spasms, her mouth still open in that wordless scream. She looked like she was drowning. But something more, something far darker, was pulling her toward them. "Move now!" Mike yelled, his voice hoarse with panic. But as they tried to retreat, the water surged forward, pushing them back. Mike stumbled, his foot catching on a rock beneath the water, and he fell forward, gasping as the cold water engulfed him. For a moment, everything went dark. The voices, the figure, the water consumed him completely. Then, as quickly as it had submerged him, the water released its grip. Mike gasped for air, his lungs burning as he pushed himself up. His flashlight had fallen into the flood, its beam cutting a weak, trembling path through the rising water. He looked around, his eyes darting frantically as he tried to get his bearings. And then he saw it again. The woman. She was standing in front of him, blocking his path. Her empty eyes were locked onto his, her mouth still wide open, as though calling out to him from some deep, forgotten place. The scream that never reached his ears filled his mind with terror, and he felt a coldness spread through his bones as though her presence was draining the warmth from his body. "Mike," Jason whispered, his voice cracked with fear. Mike turned to him, seeing the same terror mirrored on his face. "It's like she's..." Before Jason could finish, the ground beneath their feet gave way. A deep rumble vibrated through the earth, and with it, a wave of water crashed over them, sweeping them off their feet. Mike's vision blurred as the world seemed to collapse into chaos, water, shadows, and ghostly figures all twisting and turning in a nightmarish dance. As he was pulled under, the last thing Mike saw was the woman's face, still staring, still, screaming in silence, her mouth moving as if trying to drag him into the depths with her, and then everything went black. The next moment, Mike gasped, sputtering as he surfaced from the water, his body shaking uncontrollably. The floodwaters had receded somewhat, but the land was still drowning in mud, water, and debris. He pushed himself up, his arms aching from the struggle, but when he looked around, he found that the others were gone. Panic seized him, his heart racing. "Lisa! Marco! Jason!" He shouted their names into the storm, but his voice was swallowed by the relentless downpour. There was no answer. Then a sound caught his attention, a faint whisper. His name. Again. Mike. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing there. Just the thick fog and the mist swirling around the mountain like an unholy fog of death. Then, through the mist, he saw a figure standing ahead, barely visible in the dense fog. It was Marco. But as Mike rushed forward, his stomach dropped. It wasn't Marco. The figure's clothes were soaked, but the face. Mike's breath caught. The face was wrong. It was like Marco's, but distorted, twisted with something that wasn't quite human. The eyes were hollow, and the skin had taken on a ghostly pallor. Before Mike could react, the figure turned, its movements jerky and unnatural, and slowly disappeared into the fog. Mike staggered through the thick fog, his heart pounding as his breath fogged the air. His legs were heavy, his body drenched from the floodwaters, but he couldn't stop. The mountain was closing in on him, its malevolent presence wrapping around him, suffocating him. The whispers never stopped, growing louder, more insistent, swirling in his mind until the very sound of his own breath seemed to drown them out. The ghostly figures from the flood, those distorted shadows, those hollow-eyed things, were still there, lingering in the mist just out of his reach. Every step forward felt like a fight against the pull of something ancient, something terrible that wanted him to stop, to surrender. But Mike refused to give in. He had to find the others. He couldn't be the next one lost to this cursed mountain. He walked. The whispers shifted. They were no longer random voices murmuring his name. This time, there was purpose behind them. The words were fragmented, jumbled, but they seemed to form a pattern, a chant. Bound to the earth, cannot escape. Mike's pulse quickened as the voices twisted together, the sound of each word melding into something darker. He tried to ignore it, to push it out of his mind, but the words were pulling at him, dragging him forward. The fog around him began to shift, swirling in patterns that made the ground beneath his feet appear unstable. The trees, once just twisted silhouettes, now looked like something more. Their branches stretched upward, their gnarled limbs twisting into unnatural shapes, like fingers reaching for him. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, but when he opened them again, the world had changed. Ahead of him, the ground was uneven, pocked with deep circular depressions. The air felt heavier now, thicker with an oppressive, almost suffocating weight. The ground was covered with a strange, slick moss that glowed faintly in the dark, like a sickly green fire, casting an eerie light over the scene. In the center of the area was a massive stone altar, weathered and ancient, with symbols carved into its surface, symbols Mike couldn't recognize. A chill ran down his spine as he approached. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, as if they were calling him toward the altar. His steps faltered for a moment, but something inside him, a desperate need to understand what was happening, pushed him forward. As he reached the stone altar, the fog around him thickened. He could see them now, faint shapes moving in the mist. More figures, more spirits. These weren't the same distorted, bloated shadows he had seen in the flood. These were different. Their eyes were sunken, their skin pale and grey, their clothes torn and tattered. They were watching him, they were waiting for him, bound to the earth, bound to the stone. The chant had grown clearer now, and with it, an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though the mountain itself was speaking, its voice filtering through the ancient ritual that was still alive in its soil, its stones, its very air. Mike's eyes scanned the altar, and he saw what they had left behind. A series of carvings, faded but still visible. They were images of people, many people, surrounding a dark figure, a figure bound to the earth. The symbol was familiar to him, but he couldn't place it at first. The image of the bound figure was the same as the ghostly figures that had emerged from the water. His heart thudded in his chest as the realization struck him. The figure from earlier, the one who had vanished into the fog, was part of something much older than the storm. The mountain was alive, yes, but it wasn't just the land that was cursed. It was the spirits that lived within it, bound by an ancient ritual that had been forgotten long ago. As Mike's mind raced, his eyes caught something that stopped him dead in his tracks. A book lying on the altar. Its pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and yet it seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as though the book itself was aware of his presence. He reached out slowly, his hand trembling, and opened the book. The words on the pages seemed to shift. As he turned them, the ink twisting and curling in ways that made his stomach turn. As he read, a creeping sense of horror began to take hold of him. The book described the history of the mountain, the ancient rituals performed by the people who had once lived here, people who had long since vanished, but whose spirits were still bound to the land. It told of a pact made in desperation to ensure that the mountain would remain untouched by time. The ritual had required a sacrifice, a blood offering to bind the souls of the dead to the earth. But there had been a flaw. One of the offerings, one of the sacrifices, had been wrong, and that mistake had cursed the land forever. The ritual was supposed to bring peace, to ensure the spirits would rest, but it had failed. Instead, it had created a cycle, a loop of death and rebirth, a never-ending struggle between the mountain's will and the trapped souls who could never escape. The land was alive, bound by the souls of the sacrificed, and every hiker, every soul that wandered here was drawn into the ritual, They were pulled into the same cycle, never to leave. The figure, the one Mike had seen, wasn't just lost. He was part of the ritual. He had died here long ago, and now he was bound to the mountain, forever seeking escape. Just like Mike was now. The mountain had no mercy. It was hungry for more souls. Mike snapped the book shut, his heart racing. He had to get out. He had to warn the others. But as he stood up, the ground beneath him trembled. The fog around him thickened, and the figures, those lost souls, began to move toward him, their eyes fixed on him with hollow intensity. Mike. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't just the whispers. It was a real voice, deep and guttural. You can't leave. You're part of it now. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he turned to face the figure that had appeared behind him. It was the hiker, the one who had led them here, the one who had vanished. His face was hollow, his skin pale, his body frail and disfigured by time. His mouth opened in a silent scream, but Mike could hear the words, "You are bound." And then everything went dark. Mike's world was a blur of shadow and fog as he stumbled away from the altar, his heart racing in his chest. The book he had found lay forgotten on the stone, its dark secrets gnawing at the edges of his mind. The weight of what he had just uncovered, the ancient ritual, the blood sacrifice, the curse that bound the souls of the dead to the mountain, seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. He had to escape. He had to find the others. They were still out there, somewhere, lost to the mountain. But the realization hit him like a cold slap. They weren't just lost. They were part of the mountain now, like him, bound by the same ritual that had trapped those before them. The fog closed in tighter around him, the air thick with a damp, oppressive weight. His footsteps faltered as his mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. But the ground beneath him seemed to shift and distort. The trees around him, those twisted, gnarled shapes that had once seemed so familiar, now looked like something out of a nightmare, their branches stretching like claws, reaching out to grab him. He looked around, trying to steady himself, but the landscape had changed. The fog had swallowed the trail, and the mountain had become a maze of twisted, shifting corridors. Every tree looked the same, every rock was indistinguishable from the next. There was no way to tell where he was anymore, no way to find the others. Then, as if the mountain were answering his fear, a figure appeared ahead of him. It was a woman. Her clothes were tattered and stained with mud, her hair matted to her face, her eyes hollow. She stood in the mist, her body unnaturally, still as though waiting. Mike's heart skipped a beat as he recognized her. It was Lisa. "Lisa?" Mike gasped, his voice hoarse. His relief was short-lived, however, as he saw the vacant look in her eyes. She wasn't the same. She couldn't be. "Mike." Her voice was thin and broken, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You can't escape. No one ever does." The words sent a jolt of terror through him. His body froze, and for a moment, he couldn't move. The fear that had been gnawing at him suddenly became a crushing weight. The mountain was toying with him. It had already claimed Lisa, just like it had claimed the others. "Lisa, no," Mike whispered, taking a step forward, but his legs felt heavy, like the very ground beneath him was pulling him down. "Please, we can get out of here. We can..." But before he could finish, Lisa's figure flickered. It was like her body was made of smoke, fading in and out of focus, her movements jerky and unnatural. The mist around her seemed to shimmer, distorting her form, stretching it like taffy. The whispers returned, louder this time. "Bound to the earth, bound to the stone." Mike took another step, but the fog closed in around him, and in the blink of an eye, Lisa vanished, leaving behind only a hollow echo of her voice. A sound like a low, guttural growl rumbled through the mountain. Mike's head snapped around, his flashlight flickering, revealing movement in the trees. Figures, ghostly and disfigured, were emerging from the mist. The spirits, The souls trapped in the mountain were coming for him. The water, the mist, the fog, it all began to swirl around him, pulling him into the center of the mountain's dark heart. The figures that surrounded him were getting closer, their twisted faces contorting into grotesque shapes as they moved in sync, as though they were part of the same ancient ritual. Their eyes locked onto Mike with cold, empty stares, their mouths stretched into silent screams. And then, through the fog, he saw it. The altar. The stone, slick with rain and water, was at the center of the clearing. It had risen from the ground, as though the mountain had pulled it upward, its dark carvings glowing faintly with an otherworldly energy. Mike's eyes locked onto it, and for a moment he felt the pull, the same pull he had felt when he opened the book, the same pull that had called him here. The spirits were getting closer now, their movements faster, their figures distorting into nightmarish shapes. He could feel the weight of their presence, the suffocating reality of their shared suffering. They were trapped here, bound to the earth, forever. Mike stumbled toward the altar, the flood rising around him once again. His heart hammered in his chest, his breathing ragged as he struggled to move. The whispers in the air became deafening, growing louder, more frantic, until they felt like they were inside his mind, tearing through his thoughts. The words twisted, reshaped, like a chant spoken by 1,000 voices, bound to the earth, bound to the stone. He reached the altar, his eyes scanning the stone carvings once more. And then he saw it, the symbol, the same one he had seen in the book etched into the altar's surface. It was an ancient sigil, a symbol of binding. But now he saw the full meaning. The ritual hadn't failed. It had only changed form. The mountain's curse was not a mistake. It was a punishment. The souls trapped here were never meant to be freed. They were bound to the earth, bound to the mountain, forever repeating the cycle of death and rebirth. And now he was part of it. He was trapped, just like the others. His hand shook as he reached out to touch the stone. As his fingers brushed against the cold surface, the ground beneath him trembled. The mountain groaned, the fog swirling around him with violent force. The spirits were closing in. Mike could feel it. He was becoming part of the cycle. The binding had begun. The mountain's grip was tightening, pulling him deeper into its curse. And then, with a final deafening roar, the earth split open beneath him. Mike's mind was spinning. He could barely stand, his legs weak from exhaustion and fear, the floodwaters rising rapidly around him. The spirits, their twisted forms rising from the earth like grotesque statues brought to life, were closing in, their hollow eyes locked onto him with an unnerving intensity. The whispers were louder now, their voices filling the air with a maddening pressure, as though the mountain itself was suffocating him. Bound to the earth, bound to the stone. The chant repeated in his ears, drowning out everything else. Every step he tried to take felt heavier, as though the ground itself was pulling him back, weighing him down with each movement. The water was up to his waist now, its cold tendrils wrapping around his legs like skeletal hands, urging him to stay, to become part of the cycle. Every time he tried to move, the weight of the mountain pressed harder, the flood seeming to rise with every breath he took. Mike's hand reached for the stone altar once again. The symbols, the sigil that he had seen in the book, glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that mirrored his heartbeat. He could feel the power of the ritual thrumming through the air, through his own body, as though he was becoming part of the very thing he feared most. "Mike," a voice called softly behind him. He spun around, heart in his throat. His flashlight trembled in his hand, the beam cutting through the fog to reveal a figure standing in the mist, Lisa. But this time her body was even more disfigured, her skin pale, her limbs stretched unnaturally long. She stepped toward him, her eyes vacant, her mouth opening in a silent scream. "Lisa, no." Mike whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. He could feel the cold, twisted fingers of fear wrap around his throat. Please. You're not real. This isn't you. But Lisa's form only continued to twist and distort. Her limbs jerked unnaturally, and her eyes, those hollow eyes, stared directly at him. It's too late, Mike. You're part of it now. There is no leaving. There is only the cycle. The whispering voices grew louder, their words incomprehensible, but it was clear now. They were no longer just calling him. They were calling for all of them. They wanted all of the souls who wandered here. They wanted the flesh, the life force, to feed the mountain, to keep it alive. Mike's legs buckled as the flood rose higher. He could feel it now, the cold water slithering up his body like tendrils, pulling him down into its grasp. It wasn't just the flood. It was something else, something darker. Mike, another voice called, but this time it wasn't Lisa's. It wasn't a human voice at all. He turned, and before him stood another figure, his own reflection, distorted and dripping with water. It moved with him, mimicking every motion he made, but it wasn't his reflection at all. Its face was hollow, its features warped, and its eyes gleamed with a cruel, twisted intelligence. No, Mike gasped, stumbling backward. The figure smiled, a twisted grin that spread unnaturally across its face, and whispered, "You are the offering." Suddenly, the flood surged forward, rushing with terrifying speed, dragging him into the water. Mike screamed, but the sound was drowned by the roar of the rushing tide, the world spinning around him. The water felt like it was alive, pulling him deeper, dragging him into its depths as the figures, the twisted versions of the lost souls, reached out with their bony, ghostly hands. He fought against it, thrashing in the water, trying to pull free. But the flood was too strong. It pulled him under, and for a moment, he felt the darkness close in around him, cold, suffocating, and crushing. But then, something changed. The whispers stopped. The flood's pull weakened, and Mike felt himself drifting in the cold water, the world above him a blur. He opened his eyes, disoriented, trying to make sense of what was happening. In the distance, he saw something. A figure. It was the hiker, the man who had led them here, the one who had been lost for so long. But now, his figure was standing, towering above the floodwaters, his body still, like a shadow in the mist. His hollow eyes stared at Mike with a knowing, cruel look. "You don't belong here," the figure whispered. But his voice wasn't the voice of a man. It was the voice of the mountain, deep and ancient. "You were never meant to leave." Mike's chest tightened as the figure reached out a hand. The air around him crackled, and the world seemed to stretch, time itself bending around the figure's gesture. The floodwaters receded, and Mike felt his body being pulled toward the hiker, but not by his own will. The mountain had a hold on him now. He was part of its ritual, its endless cycle. "No," Mike cried out, but the word died in his throat as the figure's hand drew closer. The flood surged again, and Mike felt his body go rigid, paralyzed by the force that gripped him. But then, something strange happened. The voices, the whispers, began to fade. The water that had once been an overwhelming force seemed to retreat, as though it were retreating from something deeper, darker, something more terrifying. Mike's body twisted in the floodwaters as he was pulled deeper still. He could see the altar again, just below the surface of the water. But now the symbols on the altar were glowing brighter, pulsing with an eerie, unnatural light. He couldn't stop it. His body was no longer his own. He was sinking into the mountain, his mind slipping away into the darkness. But just as the last threads of his consciousness began to unravel, something broke free. The stone altar erupted in a blinding light. Mike's vision exploded in white, and he screamed, but the scream was swallowed by the mountain. The light from the altar burned brightly in Mike's vision, a blinding flare that threatened to consume him entirely. His chest felt tight, suffocating, as the floodwaters churned around him, pulling him deeper into the earth's dark heart. He wanted to scream, to fight against the overwhelming pressure that gripped his body and mind, but every breath felt like an eternity. The world around him twisted, its reality warping and distorting in ways that made his sanity tremble. The whispers had stopped, at least for a moment, but the absence of their haunting voices only heightened the silence that followed. It was an eerie stillness, the kind of quiet that preceded something terrible. The figure of the hiker was still there, looming in the fog, his features twisted and contorted, his hollow eyes boring into Mike's very soul. The man was no longer just a lost traveler, no longer a victim of the mountain's curse. He was a manifestation of it, an agent of the ritual, one of the countless souls bound to the land for eternity. You think you can escape? The hiker's voice was cold, the words like ice scraping against Mike's very bones. You are no different from the others. You are a part of the cycle now. Mike could feel the pressure of the words, the weight of the truth that hung in the air. He was part of it, part of the ritual that had been set in motion long ago, part of the cycle of death and rebirth that had cursed this mountain for generations. The souls, the spirits that haunted the fog, the water, they were all bound to the mountain, to this endless loop of suffering. And now, Mike was one of them. No, this can't be. Mike's voice faltered as he tried to stand, his body heavy, paralyzed by the floodwaters and the weight of the mountain's grip. He had felt this pull before, but now it was more than just the water, more than just the fog. It was the mountain itself, its hunger, its thirst for souls. The figure of the hiker stepped forward, his form flickering in and out of existence like a mirage, as though he were made of smoke and shadow. You cannot fight it. The mountain is a living thing. It feeds on the lost, on the broken, on those who wander too close. And now it has claimed you. You will be one of us, forever. As the hiker spoke, the spirits around Mike began to move. Slowly at first, but then faster, their forms emerging from the mist. Their hollow eyes fixed on him. Their faces were distorted, their bodies disfigured by time. But they all had one thing in common: the same blank, empty expression that marked the victims of the mountain's curse. The lost souls who had been trapped here, their lives stolen by the ritual. Please, Mike whispered, desperation clawing at his throat. I don't want this. But the spirits ignored him, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were puppets controlled by some unseen force. They moved closer, their fingers reaching out to touch him, to claim him as their own. And then, in that moment, Mike understood. The ritual had not failed. It was never meant to fail. The mountain did not want to release its captives. It wanted more. It wanted to feed. The souls, the spirits, they were not just lost. They were the mountain's nourishment, bound to the earth to fuel its insatiable hunger. And now, Mike was part of that cycle. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the water surged higher, drowning him in its cold embrace. The figures closed in, their hands gripping his arms, their touch icy and unnatural. Mike could feel them, feel their anguish, their endless torment. And it was as if he was being torn apart, piece by piece. His mind fractured as the weight of the mountain's curse consumed him. "Mike, help me," a voice cried out from the fog, and Mike's eyes snapped. Open, it was Jason. Jason's face appeared through the mist, his expression one of terror. His eyes were wide, his body drenched in water, but there was something different about him. His form was blurred, distorted, as if he was not entirely solid. The other figures, the spirits, were moving around him, but he was still trapped in the same cycle, his body slowly shifting and flickering like a shadow. "Jason," Mike called, his voice hoarse as he struggled to free himself from the spirit's grasp. "Jason?" "Hold on, I'm coming!" But Jason's form was fading. It flickered like a dying flame, his voice growing distant as the spirits dragged him back into the fog. "You can't escape, Mike. No one ever does. Don't let it take you." With a final, agonizing scream, Jason vanished into the mist, his form disappearing like the others before him. Mike felt the air grow colder, the floodwaters dragging him deeper still. The spirits closed in around him, their hands pressing against his skin, their fingers cold and slick. "Please!" Mike screamed. "I'm not one of you! Let me go!" But the spirits didn't listen. They didn't need to. They were the mountain's agents, its hunger personified. And as they pulled him deeper into the flood, Mike knew he had become part of the cycle. There was no escaping the mountain now. The ground beneath him shifted violently as though the very earth was alive, shaking with fury. The altar stone in the distance began to glow brighter, its symbols pulsing with a dark, rhythmic energy. The spirits, those lost souls, were gathering around him now, their voices joining in one final deafening chorus. Bound to the earth, bound to the stone, forever. And as the mountain's darkness closed in on him, Mike finally understood. The mountain was not just alive. It was alive with the souls of the lost. It didn't just trap them. It consumed them, fed off them, and used their suffering to perpetuate the cycle of torment that had lasted for centuries. And now, he was a part of that cycle. He was bound to the stone. Mike's chest constricted, his heart pounding in his ears as the world around him became a blur of fog, water, and disembodied whispers. The spirits were closing in, their hands like ice, their fingers crawling along his skin, their touch leaving a chill that sunk deep into his bones. Each spirit's touch felt like a thread, slowly weaving him into the very fabric of the mountain's cursed existence. His legs, once strong and sure, were now like jelly beneath him, shaking uncontrollably. As the floodwaters rose higher, "You can't escape." The voice that had called out to him earlier, Jason's voice, was now just a distant echo, reverberating through the fog. The figure of Jason, distorted and blurred by the mist, flickered before him like a dying ember. Mike tried to push forward, his muscles screaming in protest, but the mountain wouldn't let him. The water pulled at him, the figures pressed closer, their cold hands clasping his arms, forcing him toward the altar, the very center of the ritual that had claimed so many before him. His legs felt like lead as he stumbled, barely keeping his footing. The altar glowed in the distance, its symbols pulsing like a heartbeat. The stone at its center was dark and slick with rainwater, but there was something else, something deeper, that glimmered beneath the surface. A dark energy, ancient and suffocating, emanated from the stone, and Mike could feel it calling to him. His body reacted before his mind could comprehend the sensation. He was being pulled toward it, unable to fight the force that seemed to beckon him closer. "No." Mike gasped, his voice hoarse and desperate as the spirits circled him. "I won't. I can't." But as he approached, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the earth, deep and resonant, as though the mountain itself was waking up. The fog thickened, swirling around him with greater intensity, until he could barely see his own hands in front of his face. The figures, those lost souls, those damned spirits, stirred restlessly, their heads jerking in unison, their movements like marionettes controlled by the will of the mountain. They pressed in closer, their hollow eyes now fixed on him with an unrelenting gaze. Mike could feel their pain, their suffering, their endless yearning for release. But they couldn't escape. not unless the ritual was completed. The altar loomed ahead, its symbols now glowing so brightly that it was almost blinding. Mike's thoughts were scattered, his mind clouded with panic and despair. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to escape, but there was no way out. The mountain was alive, the ritual was alive, and he was part of it now. There was no escaping the cycle. His footstep faltered as he reached the stone altar, the ground vibrating beneath him, and the energy that radiated from it seemed to surge through his body like a shockwave. The spirits circled him, their chants rising in volume, blending into an unbearable cacophony of whispers and screams. Mike reached out, trembling, to touch the stone. The moment his fingers made contact, the world seemed to collapse around him. Time itself twisted, bending in on itself. The ground cracked open and the mountain let out a deafening roar. A blinding light shot up from the altar, enveloping everything in its path, pulling Mike deeper into the heart of the ritual. He felt his body jerk violently, as though he were being torn apart and reassembled at the same time. His mind screamed in terror, but there was no sound, only the deafening pulse of the stone and the overwhelming pull of the mountain's power. For a moment, Mike felt himself slipping into the darkness, his consciousness slipping away from him. The floodwaters swirled around him, pulling him deeper, but then he felt it. The sensation that had gripped him since the moment he stepped onto the mountain, the cold, suffocating grip of the curse, finally began to break apart. The stone pulsed again, this time with a dark and violent energy, and Mike's vision cleared. He could see the figures now, more clearly than ever, those who had been trapped here, bound to the stone by the ritual. They were not just victims, they were part of the earth itself, their souls intertwined with the mountain's will, there, suffering feeding the cycle. And in the center of it all, the heart of the ritual, the dark energy that had held them there, was now awakening fully. And there, at the center of the ritual, Mike saw it, the heart of the mountain. It was a thing of twisted, grotesque beauty. It pulsed with a sickly, dark light, its shape constantly shifting, part stone, part flesh, an organic mass of pulsing veins and jagged edges. It was a heartbeat, ancient and cruel, and it was alive. Its roots sank deep into the earth, into the very soul of the mountain, connecting it to everything: the flood, the fog, the spirits, the ritual. The realization struck Mike like a lightning bolt. The heart of the mountain was the source of everything. It had been fed by the souls of the lost for centuries, and now it wanted more. It wanted him. It wanted them all. No, Mike whispered, his voice choked with terror. But the mountain was relentless. The spirits, the figures, they had no choice. They were trapped, just as he was. They were the mountain's nourishment, feeding its eternal hunger, bound to the stone for eternity. Mike's body trembled as the dark energy surged through him. He could feel it now. The ritual had already claimed him. He could feel the pulse of the mountain inside him, inside his very soul. The darkness pressed in, suffocating him, pulling him into the cycle. And as the last remnants of his consciousness began to fade, he realized the terrifying truth. He was no longer a man. He was part of the mountain. His soul, bound to its heart, would feed its endless hunger just as those before him had. And as the darkness closed in, he knew he would never escape. He would never be free. The cycle would continue forever. The mountain's grip on Mike was absolute, suffocating. The darkness that had enveloped him now pulsed within his very veins, coursing through his body like a poison. His mind felt as if it were being stretched, pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. The spirits, their hollow eyes, their cold, unfeeling hands, were all around him, dragging him deeper into the heart of the mountain. But even as the floodwaters continued to rise and the spirits circled him, something in Mike snapped. The weight of the curse, the knowledge that he was now a part of this endless cycle of death and rebirth was crushing. The mountain was alive, yes, but so was its curse, its hunger. It wanted more, and now it had him. Yet, in the deepest part of his mind, a flicker of defiance remained. It was a small thing, buried beneath layers of fear, panic, and terror, but it was there. He would not let himself be consumed by this hell, not without a fight. He glanced around the altar, his vision blurred by the fog and the mist, but he could see it, the pulsating heart of the mountain. The ritual was drawing to a close, and the dark energy surrounding the altar had reached a fever pitch. The sigils on the stone glowed brighter now, their malevolent power surging with each passing second. The spirits, those lost souls, circled, faster, their chant rising in volume until it became deafening, a roar in his ears that drowned out everything else. Mike. The voice came again, low and guttural. He could hear Jason's voice, distant, fading, like a whisper in the wind. It's too late. You're part of it now. No. Mike gritted his teeth, his fists clenched, the weight of the spirit's pull growing heavier. No, I'm not. I won't be. The figure of the hiker, his twisted, shadowed form, loomed before him. You have no choice, the hiker intoned, his voice cold and hollow. You were called here. You were chosen. There is no escape. You are bound to the heart, just like the others. Mike stepped forward, his body shaking with the effort, the water rising higher with every movement. He could feel the mountain pulling at him, urging him to stop, to surrender, to give in to the inevitable. But the flicker of defiance that burned within him refused to die. I'm not like them, Mike said, his voice hoarse but filled with determination. I'm not going to be part of your cycle. I will break it. The spirits shifted, their hollow eyes turning toward him as if the words were foreign to them. The air grew colder, the floodwaters swelling with a new intensity, and the heartbeat of the mountain grew louder, pounding in his chest. But Mike didn't falter. He reached forward, his hand trembling as it hovered above the dark heart of the mountain. You can't break it, the hiker's voice echoed. You're already part of it. You've always been. The mountain trembled beneath his feet, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The spirit stilled. The fog, the flood, the very land itself held its breath. And in that moment of stillness, Mike saw it. Clearly now, the truth. The mountain's heart wasn't just a thing of flesh and stone. It was something far older, something that had existed long before the land had been shaped, long before the ritual had begun. It was the source of the curse, the anchor of the ritual that had bound the souls for eternity. And it was not merely a vessel for the trapped souls. It was their prison. It fed on them, yes, but it also kept them. The souls of the lost, Jason, Lisa, and everyone else who had wandered into this cursed place. They had been consumed by the mountain's hunger, and their torment, their suffering, was what kept the mountain alive. They weren't just feeding it, they were bound to it. And Mike realized with a sudden terrible clarity that the only way to break the curse, to free them all, was to destroy the heart, to end the cycle once and for all. But to do that, he had to make the ultimate sacrifice. The mountain groaned again, its pulse quickening, the heartbeat now a deafening roar in his ears. The spirits closed in, their hands reaching toward him, pulling him closer to the stone. The fog thickened, and the water swirled violently around his legs. He could feel it now. He could feel the spirits' agony, their endless suffering. And in that moment he understood. He couldn't break the cycle without becoming part of it. He had to give himself to the mountain. Mike turned toward the altar, his breath shallow and ragged. He could hear the voices, the whispers growing louder. He could feel the hands of the spirits closing in on him, pulling him toward the heart. And he knew what he had to do. His heart raced, the weight of the decision sinking in. But there was no turning back. There was no other way. He stepped forward, and, with one final gut-wrenching scream, he thrust his hand into the dark heart. The moment his hand made contact, the world around him exploded. The world erupted into light. The moment Mike's hand touched the heart of the mountain, an explosion of energy surged through him, searing his entire body with an unbearable intensity. It was as though his very essence was being torn apart and reformed at the same time. The floodwaters receded. The spirits shrieked in unison, and the heartbeat of the mountain, once deafening, faded into an eerie, hollow silence. For a fleeting moment, Mike thought he had been consumed entirely, swallowed up by the mountain's dark power. His body was numb, his vision fading as though he was sinking into an endless abyss. His heart, his mind, everything felt like it was being shredded to pieces. The stone, the spirits, the fog, everything he had witnessed, everything he had feared, blurred into one overwhelming force. But then something shifted. He saw them, the figures, the souls that had been trapped here for so long. Lisa, Jason, and the others were standing before him, their forms distorted, flickering like shadows, but their faces were different. Their hollow eyes, once full of torment and hunger, were now filled with something else, something Mike had never thought possible: peace. They were not bound to the mountain anymore. They were free. And then the vision shifted again. The stone, altar, once a vessel for the mountain's dark heart, crumbled before him. The sigils that had once pulsed with dark energy faded, their power disintegrating into the air like dust. The very ground beneath him shook violently, as though the mountain was shaking off its ancient burden. The fog, the flood, the oppressive air, all of it began to unravel. The spirits, those who had been trapped here for centuries, began to fade, their twisted bodies dissipating into the wind, their suffering finally ending. Their eyes, once so cold and hungry, now held nothing but calm. The mountain's curse had finally been broken. Mike's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. He had done it. He had broken the cycle, but it came at a cost. As the world around him began to dissolve into light, Mike felt himself being pulled, no longer by the mountain's force, but by something else. His body was still whole, but the pain, his mind, his soul felt distant. He was slipping away, fading into the nothingness as if the mountain's grip had released him. But at the price of his very existence, he reached out, his fingers trembling, but there was nothing left to hold on to. Then, in the final moments before the darkness consumed him entirely, he saw a face. Not a spirit, not a ghost. It was his own. He stood at the edge of the mountain, looking out into the void. His reflection in the foggy waters seemed different, calm, serene, and at peace. It was the last piece of himself, the part of him that would never be consumed by the curse. And in that moment, Mike understood. The mountain had always been more than just a place. It was a manifestation of suffering, of memory, a dark force that fed on the lost, the broken, the souls it had claimed. But now, with the ritual broken, with the curse lifted, the mountain was no longer the prison it once was. The spirits that had been trapped here, the souls of the lost, they were free. They had escaped the cycle. But Mike was now the last piece of the ritual that had held the mountain together. He had given himself to the mountain, his sacrifice sealing the curse's end. But that same sacrifice had also severed his ties to the world. He was no longer truly alive. He was no longer truly dead. He was a memory, a shadow in the mountain's history. His body dissolved, not in pain, but in release. The mountain's hunger had been quenched, its cycle broken. But Mike had become part of the mountain's legacy, an echo of its final chapter. He let out one last breath as his body faded into the mist, his soul becoming part of the very essence of the mountain that had once claimed him, and then there was nothing. The morning after the storm broke, the mountain stood still. The wind had died down, the fog had lifted, and the floodwaters had receded, leaving behind a silence that felt too heavy, too complete. The trees, once twisting and unnaturally alive, were now just trees, gnarled and weathered by time, but unmoving, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The haunting echoes of the whispers, the cries, the dark chant, all of it had disappeared, as if the mountain itself had exhaled a final breath and released its grip on the land. The hikers, those who had wandered too close to the mountain, those who had been consumed by its curse, were gone. Their spirits, their agony, had all faded with the breaking of the ritual. For the first time in centuries, the land was at peace, or so it seemed. The park ranger station at the base of the mountain was quiet, its usual hum of activity absent. The roads that wound around the mountain were clear, the sky above bright with the promise of a new day. But something was wrong. Mike's disappearance hadn't gone unnoticed. A team of local authorities had arrived at the base of the mountain, days after the storm had passed. They had been searching for the missing hikers, Mike, Lisa, Jason, and the others, ever since the storm had hit, and their disappearance was still being investigated. They found no trace of the team, no sign of struggle or violence, only the remnants of their equipment scattered across the area. The mountain was strangely silent, almost as if it had swallowed them whole. The ranger station was crowded now, the air thick with murmurs and hushed voices. Ranger Carter stood outside, staring at the distant peaks, his eyes scanning the horizon as though looking for something he couldn't find. The others, those who had searched the mountain before, were all present, but there was no sign of the missing team. The search parties had covered the area multiple times, and yet they could find no bodies, no clues, only a disturbing emptiness. They weren't sure what had happened, but they all felt it. The storm was bad, one of the rangers said, shaking his head, but nothing like this. Carter remained silent, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the ridge that had once been the heart of the storm. He had been on this mountain for years, but something in his gut told him that whatever had happened here, it wasn't just the storm. It wasn't just an accident. He had seen things during his time on the mountain. Strange things, things people couldn't explain, but nothing like this. The curse that had gripped this place for so long had been broken, or so they thought. But in the quiet aftermath of the storm, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered in the air, something he couldn't quite understand. In the distance, the mountain stood silent and still, but something about it felt wrong, like a memory that refused to fade, like the echo of something dark that hadn't quite been erased. Carter turned, his gaze lingering on the distant ridge once more before he walked back toward the station. As he did, he passed the station's bulletin board. Among the usual reports and notices was a new entry, one that hadn't been there the day before. It was a photograph, black and white, faded by time, but its edges sharp and crisp in the dim light. The image showed a hiker standing alone in the fog, his face obscured by shadow. His clothes were torn and weathered, much like the others who had disappeared over the years. But there was something different about this one. This one had a look of recognition in his eyes. The caption underneath the photo read, "Missing hiker, last seen on Copper Ridge, 12 years ago. Authorities have no leads." Carter stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen that face before, in his memories, in his nightmares. It was one of the lost hikers, the one who had gone missing 12 years ago, just as the others had. He had thought the mystery was solved. He had thought the curse was broken. But now, with the fog lifting and the land quiet once more, Carter realized the terrifying truth. The mountain had been silent for too long. Its hunger had only been momentarily sated. The cycle hadn't truly ended. The mountain wasn't finished, and the curse, though broken in some ways, would always find a way to begin again. To claim those who ventured too close, to pull them into its eternal cycle of suffering. The photograph, the name, the face, they were all reminders that the ritual had never truly ended. It had only taken a new form. The curse was alive. It was waiting. The ground beneath Carter's feet seemed to tremble slightly, almost imperceptibly. The air grew colder, and the whispers, though faint, returned once more, as though the mountain itself was exhaling, preparing for its next offering. And deep within the heart of the mountain, the dark stone altar pulsed once again, its sigils glowing faintly as it waited for the next soul to wander too close. The curse wasn't over. It was never over, and the mountain's hunger would never cease.